All right. Hello. My name is Tom DiGiulio. I'm here to introduce Dani here. You probably all know her in some way or another. I just want to quickly share that she has been a real mentor for me in my process and my journey, and a resource I draw upon all the time. I'm always inspired by her energy and enthusiasm and her challenges, and she always shows up. I'm so happy that you have all decided to show up and be part of this conversation. So let's welcome Dani.
All right, so I planned this as a lesson. I'm gonna go through this lesson like I do with my students, but I'm gonna go through it in a way where you can respond a little bit and then we can stop and check in with questions. So the format is really demo lesson. All my students have when we do this is a composition book and something to write with. And my format for class is usually that we have, I call them analog Chromebooks because we're a one-to-one school. So everybody has a composition book that lives in my classroom and they write in them every day. Sometimes they're doing Latin composition. Sometimes it's scaling questions, 1 to 5. How do you feel about this new concept? Look back and see something you were confused about. How confused are you now? What made the difference? So they're used to using these every day. The other thing that has happened by the time I do this lesson is that, and the context is a high school, usually high school Latin 1 class. We're a Title I public school. There's no private schools for high school in my town. There are no charter schools. We're the only high school. So unless children are being homeschooled, they're in my building, which is something that I think is pretty unique these days. But one thing that's happened by the time I do the lesson is that we know each other. I don't drop this the first week. So if you have any questions about establishing, classroom climate or what kinds of norms we establish, feel free to let me know, or you can ask about that later. But this is not something we're doing on day 2. The format I have is I give students prompts and then I give them time to write and then we share. So that we'll just go through it that way. I have lots of students where it's the end of the semester and I realize I haven't heard their voice before, but I really feel like I know them because they can write in their composition books. And I try to make sure I give some feedback or at least mark their text so that they know that I've seen it. And then students who do a good job, and everybody does a good job, they get stickers. So I don't have stickers today, but I will say I'm a brag, like my sticker collection is really, really good. So I have like 18-year-old, men telling me that they want, a certain Yeti sticker with a t-shirt on it. And they're really special, sloths, hedgehogs. I should present on stickers, but so anyway. So I'm gonna go through like I would, with my students. I have a 90-minute block, so I did try to time this out. There's some things that I do with them that we won't have time for that I can tell you about at the end, but I also hope to build in time for questions as we go. So my school is very big into framing the learning, so we're supposed to have everything up that they're going to learn by the end of class. For this lesson, I don't tell them it's about slavery initially because they're just going to be writing about a couple words. And if they know it's about slavery, part of my concern is that they would be thinking, okay, how does this relate to slavery? So the first thing I have them do that you can do too, and I'm hoping we can do some quick participation, is just what comes to mind when, I hope everybody can hear me, the word property. So you're just going to write about property. What do you think about when you hear the word property? And I also ask them to kind of rate the word. Is it positive? Is it neutral? Is it negative? Is it always positive? So just some information about property. And then while people are writing, an advantage of the composition books is for these conversations, I can go around and kind of mark things as I go. And then students who are afraid to participate, if I say, wow, that's a really good point, maybe you want to share that, then they kind of know ahead of time that, ooh, but for something like this, there are no bad ideas. But sometimes when students are writing for certain topics, or if it's even just something related to Latin, I'll go around and mark it. And that way, if it's time to participate, some students who are less inclined to participate know, hey, this is something that I already know is really good. I don't need to be nervous about not having a good idea. So sometimes I'll walk around and do that as they write. All right, so what do we have for property? Yeah.
Like a belonging?
Yeah, belonging. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Demarcation and separation.
Yeah, demarcation and separation. Yeah. Land and plots of land, and that's big in my town. Most, I think, I can't remember the exact percentage of people who rent in my town, but lots of people rent. So it's always a big deal when somebody's, buys a house. That's a big deal. We have lots and lots of renters and also high turnover. So sometimes that'll come up in terms of, wow, it's nice to have property. That means, you're not going to be moving, or this is something that's yours. It's yours, not mine. It's something that belongs to me. What else do you have with property?
Objects.
Objects, yes, objects. Yeah.
So it's protected by the law?
Yeah, something good, something that's protected by the law. So I'll usually have a list of things that I sort of want to come up. Typically, the students will cover them all. So going into these, I'll have some a little list where if the students aren't filling it in, I'll say at the end, what about, and then they'll tend to, keep going a little bit more. So that way, the students are providing the information. It's not me saying, okay, here's what property is. Let's look at 8 slides on property. So how do people feel about property in here? Just general.
Oh, I was just sort of saying that.
Yeah, kind of.
Not great.
Not great. Not great. Yeah. Yeah.
It feels like a burden.
A burden. Yeah, it can be a burden.
I would say negative. I think it's problematic and was created in large part for upper class exploitation of lower class. So.
I think positive too, because financial security, and it's something you can pass on to your kids in the future.
Yeah, and
From generation to generation.
yes. And that's my experience too. People like to have things. They like to have things that are their own. I have a lot of kids. We have 6 kids. So if they have something that's theirs, even if it's hey, these are too small, pass them down. No, this is mine. It's something that belongs to me. But then there's a question of, okay, who does this actually belong to? And that can be tricky too. All right. So the next one is just work without pay. Work without pay. Or working for free. So what do we have about working for free?
Is it internship?
Internship, yeah. And there are, I don't have this book in my room, but I think there's a resource somewhere, not a self-made one, that kind of compares slavery to an internship. But yes, there's internship. Exploitation.
Is it work if it's not paid?
Is it work if it's not paid? Yeah.
If I rake leaves in my yard, it's a chore.
Yeah.
If I pay somebody to do it, it's work.
Right. Interesting.
Unjust.
Unjust.
I wrote generally not okay, but positive if it's volunteer work.
That came up this year because at my school, students need volunteer hours for certain things. Even just, I think there's a certain kind of diploma. Virginia has different kinds. They need their volunteer hours. Some people want volunteer hours for things like National Honor Society, and that's really big too. Interact, we have a service fraternity, and then it's all about getting hours, and none of them are paid. So that's a pretty big part of our culture at school is accruing these hours. And, you know, part of the culture too is actually, you know, doing some good in the community, but a lot of it is getting hours. So a lot of kids brought up the volunteering, and I thought that one was going to be negative. That was a new one I added, and I was surprised how many people were like, yes, because you should help. Then we got into a little bit with that about, okay, when you're helping, what kind of power situation is that there? You know, just a little bit. So is that still good? Anything else with work without pay?
Why is it a situation you chose to be in? Is it like, are you getting something out of it? It's not pay, but it's.
Yeah. And I think one unique thing about doing this in the context of high school is most of them are minors. You have some students who are 18, but I mean, really, none of them really have rights. They're literally disenfranchised. So, you know, you're told to do something, you're told to wear certain kinds of clothes, you're told not to have a hat on. I mean, from their attire to, you know, just the environment of pretty much all secondary schools. Bell rings, you're getting up and moving to the next class, and you're sitting down in a certain seat. And then the bell rings again and you get up and go. And then you stand in line for your food and you have a code you put in to pay for it. And then the bell rings at the end of the day and you get on a certain bus, and then you go home and take care of your siblings for free. You're not getting paid. I mean, a lot of the students I've found they're not questioning this as much, where they're waiting. A lot of them too are younger, and they're waiting for the day they can get paid to do work. But I think, you know, there's students in my school who work full-time jobs. They go and work, you know, in factories from 4 p.m. to midnight. I had students who were harvesting fruit in the morning for vineyards. We have a large migrant population. So there's students who are working for pay that, you know, they're finding that exhausting, even though, you know, there's compensation. So that's kind of a mixed one. And then I go to master as a noun. But for the first two, people are agreeing in certain contexts it could be positive. You're not going to bring up property and people go, "Ooh, you can't say the P word here." You know, you're not going to say, you know, work without pay. People are like, "Oh, you're volunteering, that's nice." You know, there's lots of ways that could be discussed in a very positive way. Or else if you're not getting paid, okay, what's going on? But then there's some sense that there could be some recourse, or hey, when you're 16 or you get your worker's card, you can start earning money for that. All right, so what do we have for master?
Ownership,
Ownership.
demeaning.
Demeaning.
I put undergrad. Yeah, I went to the university.
Interesting. Yeah.
Dominant.
Dominance, yeah. Power. Hierarchy, yeah. People in charge. And how are we feeling about that word? Yeah. It's probably, I mean, for me, it's a big no. I think, and you know, it kind of occurred to me that some of the things my students were saying, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. They would look at it, but then thinking that they don't have power in any circumstance. Sometimes they're viewing like the power words. Wow, that's something. That's something. Oh, when adults, you know, something where you've made it and you're in charge of things. But typically that one skews a little bit negative. But then sometimes, yeah.
So I was wondering on that front, in a lot of computer games, there will be a rank that is master.
Yes.
And it's for the
Yes.
people who are best at the game.
Yes.
Do you get that response?
Yes.
sometimes? Okay.
And Dungeons and Dragons and Latin, there's some interest overlap. So you're the dungeon master, right? So yeah, but that's I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is one they'll mention. Some kids who work with computers, and I don't know if this is still terminology, but sometimes kids, you know, work with their parents. The master slave thing in a computer, I don't know that much about that, but yeah. So sometimes that will come up. And then some people bring up dogs, you know, and everybody loves talking about their pets, you know, where they get to be in charge of something or someone that they consider almost a family member, but they've got the power, but it's an animal. So that's one that comes up. So then I kind of switched gears. And the next terms I got, Patrice Rankin wrote an article called Odysseus as Slave, and in 2016 was very generous. He was, I think it was his first year at University of Richmond, and he came up to visit my school. And he came during exam week, and about 4 hours into it, I had a big round table. They framed it as like an in-school field trip. All my students could be there as long as they wanted to. I realized I hadn't offered them water. I hadn't told them where the bathrooms were. I hadn't given them any food, and it was like 2. So that was my special hospitality in Winchester, Virginia. But he was extremely gracious with his time. We're still in touch. But that article, Odysseus as Slave, and I'll write this up with resources, is just a really, I thought it was a really good example of, I mean, it's an article that defines slavery well. It's about slavery, but he spends quite a bit of time making sure slavery is defined, versus this is about slavery where you're not really getting a definition, or you're realizing at a certain point you're reading like an economics paper and there's nothing in there about the fact that there's humans involved with this. So I highly recommend that article. And the next 2 terms are from Orlando Patterson. We go to, and I'll give them to you in a second, but his framework I read up a lot on. Somebody had challenged him and said, well, this wouldn't fit in ancient Rome. I hadn't wondered that. I just thought, what his framework is it's total domination, and he talks about social death. And he was very clear. He's like, no, this fits. So I guess there were some people saying, oh, that wouldn't fit in ancient Rome. Slavery's not that bad there. I'm not quite sure the context, but he defended it pretty well that it fits. I learned that later. I still thought, of course, it fits. It's the institution of slavery. But the next one I give them is total domination. Total domination. And I let them know they're on the non-dominant side of that. So I do guide them in that way. Because a lot of them will go to, they still do go to video games, but for them it's like, whoa, I've dominated. So I just let them know, we're going to talk about that. You're on the other side of that. And there I tend to ask, just really, is this positive, neutral, negative? And what they think about that.
When you say on the other side of that, I'm sorry, how do you say that exactly?
I say, you're not the one who's dominant. I just say it that way. I said, I say you're not dominant.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, you might have said this. About how long do you give them to write for each of them?
Longer. I have a 90-minute block, so I give them longer because I'm circulating. And then also I can check in with kids who maybe have one word and just prompt them a little bit. So I want to make sure everybody's participating. So longer. And while they're talking, I'll write them up on the board. And, if there's ones that I think I was hoping somebody would mention, I'll ask questions and see what they come up with. And I also tell them, because the reason I circulate is to make sure everybody's writing. I let them know if you're taking notes on something, you do your notes. And then when we go to a full group, draw a line under it, and then you can write more things there. And I just let them know whether we're reading or I'm talking. I said, I know what I'm saying. I know, whatever is going on. I've said this, I don't need you to repeat it back to me. I want to know if you want to write it down to remember it better for later, you think it's noteworthy, that's fine. But I try to set it up so there's maybe 2 sets of information. There's the one that they came up with before we went to full group, and then there's the one afterwards. Because otherwise, the first time I did something like this, I was getting the full group discussion from everybody. Kids would wait because they didn't want to take a risk with their ideas. And then I was getting the same exact responses. And that was kind of a loss because some of the kids who don't participate have really, really good ideas, and then they're afraid to put them down. So I just let them know you can use 2 different colors, you can draw a line, but I want to know what you thought initially. And then if you're revisiting, looking at it a different way, you can write that underneath. So total domination. everybody agrees it's very bad. I've not had anybody say that this is remotely neutral good. There's nothing, I keep waiting where maybe somebody's gonna have some clever point, and I've not had one, and I've been doing this. We're block scheduling, so I do it several times a year in the fall and the spring. I've not gotten one there.
So after they write their response, are they discussing in small groups, or is that sort of in just a class, or you just wait on the conversation?
So they write their responses and it's quiet because I want everybody to have their own ideas. And then I've done, depending on the group, like turn and talk. Other times we'll go full group. I had a class where most of them didn't talk. So that was challenging, but that's great because of the notebooks. I can go and see, and we can interact, and I can put comments in, and I know what they're thinking. So that's where anytime we're doing a discussion, they have their notebooks out, because some people are introverted, some people are anxious, some people are having an off day, some people aren't confident, some people don't feel comfortable with their peers, right? So I want to make sure there's a way I can know them and know their ideas. Yeah.
You might have already mentioned this.
Yeah.
I'm really clear, when you are looking at the responses, are you at all emphasizing that you're preferring, full sentences, or like is free association?
No, I say from the beginning, free association, they can do bullet point lists, they can do sketch notes, they can do anything they want. And that's the way I have, in terms, my class is not tracked in terms of honors or AP. I have students who are English language learners. I have students who are usually in inclusion classes. I have, all kinds of students. And sometimes writing tends to be a barrier, especially when it's by hand. So also if students have an accommodation or need to, they can obviously use their Chromebooks because we are a one-to-one school. But I'm very flexible with that. So then the next one is social depth. Yeah, go ahead.
At this point, have you brought in Patterson and Ranker, or is that subtraining?
No, I'm doing that like next, soon. Yeah, so I'm just throwing out words, and it's interesting because I think it's just not a lot of them ask where we're going with this. They're kind of just because we spend so much time with words. I think they're thinking of it like, hey, we're looking at some words, because in Latin we spend a lot of time looking at words. So they're just doing the activity, and then soon we'll bring it in. So the problem I have with social depth, and somebody, I can't remember where I mentioned this, and somebody said, oh, you can't do that with, middle schoolers and high schoolers don't get it. A lot of them don't initially. Some of them think it's literally dying in a social situation, like at a party. Some of them have, ideas where they're trying to figure out what it means. But typically when I start prompting them, this is the one where I get the most powerful responses, and then it's the one, because from here we segue into slavery. We kind of compare the two lists later, but this is the one that I can go back to throughout the year when we talk about slavery. So typically what I'll say, because generally some people are, they don't quite know what to make of it. So I asked them to make a list of things that they care about, relationships they care about. We talk about, when you think social, what does that mean? Because I think one way the textbooks go so wrong in secondary classics, and it's very upsetting, is to talk about enslaved people. And I see this sometimes, in the context of American history too, as members of a household, when they don't have any right to any relationship in their entire life, including their children. So this is the one I think is really important to spend time on, because it's bad, it's brutal, it's violent. But when you think of what is important to students, or a time they felt really bad and maybe they didn't want to come to school, they weren't sick, but what and I don't ask them to bring up personal things like that in class, but everybody can relate to feeling a certain way or having a fear of losing something or someone. And I think that that's something that helps them understand that this isn't just a financial or economic arrangement. It's not just a business agreement, because generally we're getting to that next, but a lot of times slavery is framed as just really sort of, you could be talking about, again, objects. You're really not getting into you're sanitizing it to the point where it's very easy to talk about, and it's just, ignoring the cost. So what do we have here? Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was curious about we can talk of language about the use of the word slave and slavery versus enslavement and enslaved people. How you are approaching that with your students when you use the topic.
So let's see. Yeah,
Okay.
like today. Yeah, yes. So what's happening is, I mean, we're gonna have a little bit, I'm gonna bring up slavery, and then I show them 2 lists of words. And one includes slave, the other would have enslaved person, one includes master, the other has enslaver, one has, work without pay, the other has official death, one has property, the other has total domination. And we talk about the list. So we're gonna do that. This is just, I want them to go into the vocabulary piece of it sort of as neutral as possible, because kids also, I have a lot of power in my classroom. They want to please, they want to show, I knew what you were talking about first. Really, what do these words mean to you? So what do we have for social death?
Isolation?
Isolation, yeah, isolation.
Locked in.
Locked in.
Done to you.
Yeah. Lonely, yeah. So this is the one I think, especially in high school, that students can tap into the most on some level, because I think with all of the content that involves oppression, so big ones would be, rape, slavery, imperialism, we sterilize it, even not secondary stuff, just in general. We talk about it in a way that helps us keep distance and protect ourselves. We don't need to be raw and emotional every single time, but I think that one thing that really started to not upset me, but it felt like a form, not a form of negationism, it was negationism, because students get a very raw depiction of the Holocaust. And I think that's really, really important. But nobody is saying, oh, we're not going to bring up what happened there. I mean, they show videos, they show pictures, they talk about it in graphic detail. And my impression, just from talking to my students, is that they're not getting that same level of information about slavery. And I teach in Virginia, but I know that this was the case, in Maryland as well. I think it's a little bit more progressive there, but there seemed to be this, let's keep this distance here. So did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking, like, what do you say to the student who says, oh yeah, I experienced social death because I'm grounded?
Well, yeah, so that's the loss of rights, loss of privileges, loss of not being able to go outside. So I would just draw it into, you don't have any right to anything, essentially. You don't exist, you're invisible.
I guess I'm asking you if you would think that's a bad comparison.
Well, I'm not, so at this stage, I'm not comparing it at all. It's like, what would that be? But then, that way when we talk about slavery, we come across, so this sets it up so that when I come across a resource in a textbook that says, okay, so this is, I think it's called To Be a Roman. Enslaved people, or they were calling them slaves, lived better than people in the insula down the street, and they were valued members of their household and family. Well, that lets me say, okay, let's remember, I don't use that text, but variations of that come up, and then this is so remember, they might be in the household, but they don't even have a right to their own family. If they're living with their family, that they have there's no guarantee, that's not guaranteed for them. They could lose that at any moment. And even just the potential to lose it, like the potential for being grounded, like where you don't have control or power. And sort of the flip side of it is they can empathize a lot with not having any rights, but they're so used to it, it's hard for them to imagine how, the rights adults have and the flexibility, just in terms of not needing an adult to get you from point A to point B. So at that point, we go to, so we established that is kind of, focusing on the relationships, institutions like marriage, thinking about celebrations they might like, things they might enjoy, things that sort of make their life a life. It's not, I don't think when people talk about their lives, they're talking about, oh, it's really cool, I spent, $2.25 on lunch. You're talking about your experiences, with people and your interactions. So that's how I frame social death, and Orlando Patterson's essay is great. So I use that during class as well. That's a good resource. So at this point, I just asked them how they learned about slavery. And some kids still don't know where we're going with this, but then I just asked them how they learned about slavery. So if you can write that down, how did your teachers, teach you about slavery? and this is a point, this was sort of a new thing I added. I noticed I had people talking about slavery, writing about it, and then getting to the point where they're realizing this isn't a good thing. And then they would fall right into, but back then it was okay, and a lot of the masters were good. So that's where some people will go like full lost cause, Confederate. So what I say at this point is, while you're writing, I'm just interested in knowing how you learned about it. And when we, from this point forward, you know, if you have any questions about, we're operating on the premise that this is a very immoral human rights violation. This is very bad. So I said, nothing we're going to talk about today should involve defending slavery or making it less bad. If you're feeling like it's bad, that's fine. But we're not going to talk about ways it might be good, because people will come up with things that are pretty problematic. And I've also noticed sometimes I've had students of color kind of make light of slavery, almost like, there's a Brett Stevens essay, Whistling Vivaldi. I was confused at first, but it seemed like a way to signify I'm not going to be trouble in this discussion. I'm just going to get right out here and say, oh, I don't think it's that big of a deal. And it confused me at first, but then I realized that was probably a way to signal, you know, and fit in, which is really sad. So from this point, I started bringing that up right away. You know, a core value of our conversation is that we're recognizing we're not going to make this better. You're not going to try to make this better. So I am curious, how did you all learn about slavery?
Hello. I was taught in Germany, where I learned Latin, and in language class, I don't think it ever came up, like except for this is the word for slave and this is the word for master. And I think in ancient history, I was 12, and it wasn't discussed in any other way except for this is a sort of economic situation, slaves were undermined, etc. And you don't need to know my history, but I switched schools. I've never learned in a systematic way about slavery anywhere else in the world. Like, it's not been taught to me in a formal setting.
As a Jewish girl growing up in New York suburbs, sort of, there was the Hebrew school slaves and the pyramids narrative, and then there was the sort of general American history. This was just a thing that happened. It was mainly in the South, and this was an institution that was evil, but we quashed it. That was sort of the way there. And there were later in high school teachers that obviously would delve deeper, but it was sort of just regarded as a fact rather than, you know, the cancer.
Growing up in Mississippi, where I was born, morally, for sure. So socially, like every community member that I had, of course, talks about it, just isn't back to the ancestry. In school, very aware of the existence of enslaved people, not that they were, that people were slaves, not that they were enslaved until about AP history.
Wow. Okay. Mark.
So I grew up in Massachusetts, and we learned about it in the 70s when I was in middle school, and we learned how it was, you know, one of those things that people down south did, and that it was really good for the economy. It was very objective the way we talked about it, but then eventually we in the north helped to liberate them. So.
Yeah, I teach in Virginia, and I'm thinking Virginia's been a big culture shock to me, but I am realizing, learning about it in Maryland, I definitely felt like we had the moral high ground where, oh wow, we're kind of close to the South. Where's that Mason-Dixon line? But we were the good guys. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, my experience is similar, but even more so. I'm from Illinois, and so a lot of Lincoln talk, even from like a young age, of like Lincoln came from here and he freed the slaves, hurrah.
Yeah.
And I taught U.S. history at this point now, so obviously that's a much more complicated question. I make sure I say that to my students, but like even as like a young elementary school kid, like that's how it was presented to me.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that was just me as a black student. Many white students, especially in private schools in Mississippi, learned about it as like an aspect of heritage.
Oh, interesting. And another thing I'm realizing too is a problem with there's so many problems with this, but with classics being predominantly white, there's not, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't know. I've never had a white student tell me that this is something they talk about at home. As you know, this is part of our country's, this is a shame in our country, or this is not a Southern heritage in a good way, but you know, definitely, I don't believe that. I've not encountered a student doing this who said, I know a lot about slavery because we sit around and talk about how it's the scourge or anything. So I think where, you know, people will talk about things that make them comfortable, and this just isn't a topic that white people like to talk about in an honest way.
I was thinking the fact that aside from first probably learning that in church, but from the perspective of like post and like a successful like revolution and righteous and like ways of passing over, and then like the next was I think probably like in Latin class only really as like benign vocab and like no discussion of it, and then when I did learn about it in like a more in-depth like studying or way, it was objectifying. It really talked about the enslavers. It really talked about the enslaved people and the brutality there, but also specifically really only with the American Civil War and not outside of that.
Right.
I was actually taught about slavery from like a young age, to the fact that no one really remember the first time I talked about it, but it was definitely a conversation that I had in like my family and sometimes in class, but when I would get home and I would ask my parents more about it, they would explain to me more.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I learned about it from my parents in advance of, in advance of like it being taught in school, because they were like, they're gonna lie to you, so.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So at this point, I have two lists of words. So it's the kind of the first set of words. I have property, work without pay, master, slave. Sometimes I add relationship. It depends where I get to with this. And then list B is the total domination, social death, enslaver, enslaved person, rape, human sex trafficking. And I will mention Sally Hemings. There's, there's a lot in Virginia culture, kind of romanticizing relationships between enslavers and enslaved women. So I bring that up because sometimes I think the way things are, a lot of my impression, I don't teach American history, but my impression is that a lot of the time it's like this huge sacrifice to have something about Sally Hemings at Monticello, and we're not gonna talk about Thomas Jefferson being, essentially an enslaver who was, there's a non-consensual situation in there. So I bring that up and I mention Sally Hemings because that's something people are feeling pretty good about. I'll acknowledge Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, but like, okay, it's not a relationship, that's rape. And there's also a lot of myths that are sanitized. There's a lesson I came across that got me real fired up on Valentine's Day about listing, it was a matching game, it said Jupiter likes to keep things interesting. By wearing disguises, match the disguise with the lucky lady. Yeah. So, that's kind of on planet secondary Latin. I was like, oh, I'm going to use this today. I'm going to do this. But when it's intersectional and you're adding, slavery, or you're taking that dynamic and you're applying it to, of course, anybody would love to be courted by a god. It's easy to generalize that to, modern context and more modern context in terms of enslavement in the United States. So I tend to bring that up as well. And typically by then we've already talked about rape because we talked about Remus and Romulus and Mars and Rhea Silvia. So it's more I can point that out. I don't address that at the same time as this. That's something we've already discussed. So at that point, I ask them to compare the two lists. So you can take a couple minutes and just maybe 30 seconds. We'll compare the two lists. And this is where they kind of get it. They're like, oh, we've got list A, that's how I learned about it, you know, and I've had students say they felt betrayed, that they didn't learn the truth about slavery. They wondered why. They're asking me why, not rhetorical question. Why do you think they didn't tell us this?
Can you give us the list again? Like,
Yeah,
just
sure.
A, B?
Yeah, so A would be property, and I'll type this up and share it out tomorrow, but it's property, work without pay, master, slave, and relationship. I wouldn't include that one if you haven't already talked about sexual violence in the classroom. It's sort of a lot to address as a side point. List B is total domination, social death, enslaver, enslaved person, and I put also rape and human sex trafficking. Yep.
How do you respond when they ask about why they weren't taught?
Well, yeah, so what I ask next
Oh,
is,
sorry.
but a lot of these questions, because I had a less developed version of this, and because of questions like that, the questions I was getting from my students, I was like, okay, I'm kind of setting this up and leaving them hanging. So recently, I think the last year, I started making this list and asking them to evaluate those lists, and I'll have a set of questions that go with it, but typically, I mean, what's the obvious thing about the lists, A versus B? Yeah.
One is very sanitized.
Yeah.
Monolithic. The second one is raw, brutal, and representative of the terrible institution.
Yeah.
I would actually, I'm not sure, I mean, the second list is more raw, but it's also more jargon in a sense, in that the kids have not encountered the term social death before, have not encountered the term total domination. It's more technical.
Yeah, it is. And so in the 90-minute block, I spend the most time probably on the social death. So that's important. I think that's a good point. You need to spend a lot of time establishing what the terms mean. Orlando Patterson's article is a good resource. Rankin's article is fantastic because you can't leave it. And that's 100% of people. That's the reason I circulate. I look. Everybody needs to be on the bus when we move on because it's really important.
B is like, puts it in a human context. And A is a economic context.
Yeah, and that's the point where students realize, wow, okay, so I've learned about this as a business transaction. And this involves people. So what I ask, and this is relatively new, this is like the second generation lesson I do. I ask who benefits from group A, or who might use the language in group A. So I have a couple of different ways I have of asking that, but I ask them to kind of think about why would somebody use language from group A instead of group B? Because they ask that, they want to know. And then some kids said, well, maybe in 4th grade I couldn't handle it. But then that's where, I mean, I figured out from the students, they're saying, but well, you know, maybe I couldn't handle it in middle school, but we had to watch the stuff about the Holocaust, and I thought that was important. So there's not really a parity there in terms of, you can't say, oh, kids can't handle this, and then address one topic without the other. So if they were noticing things like that, and then I ask, you know, who benefits from group B, or what I don't use the word advantage, but why might somebody use the language from group B? So I'm asking them to take a look at how we talk about the language we use to talk about slavery, and I'm very explicit about it. So I get to the point where I say the language we use to talk about slavery reflects what we think about it. And if we think it's not a big deal, then we're going to be exclusively in A. But I also let them know, you know, it's not going to be this emotionally raw thing every day in class, just like with sexual violence. It's a very upsetting topic. I'll talk about it, but typically I'll say, hey, you see this heart between Mars and Rhea Silvia, that doesn't belong there. Why? And I say, oh, he's a god, and you know, she was, you know. So I'm offering this to them as a different way of looking at it, but also so that they can have awareness of how the language that they use, and you know, where do we get the language we use about this? So I also talk about how the language, you know, what they get in their textbooks is reflecting a certain reality, but also perpetuating it. And that one way to change that is to use different language when we talk about these things. So in any case, yeah, go ahead.
Do you use trigger warnings in your classroom?
Okay, so usually the most in-depth, so for the rape of Lucretia, I mentioned for sure, because that's extended. If I'm gonna have a heart with Mars and Rhea Silvia, I think that would need a trigger warning versus me saying that that's sexual violence. So if it's something, suicide, for sure. I mean, there's definitely, and also I have a policy where people can, they leave when they want. I've got my passes hanging. Because I know, I mean, I have PTSD. A big trigger for me isn't necessarily content, it's that I'm trapped. Or I'm trapped with somebody making comments about this isn't actually rape, or, you know, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm stuck here now having to listen to this. So, but anybody can get up at any time and go. I tell them I just need to know where they end up. So if they are taking a green pass to go to the bathroom and they decide they want to go to the school counseling office, they just need to have someone email me from down there so I can keep them accounted for. And that goes for any reason. I mean, I have students who can do that for any reason. So like the first time they get up and go doesn't have to be something where they're visibly uncomfortable and it's awkward. So we have procedure, and I would go over that the first day too. I don't even need to know that they're going to the bathroom. I just need to know that they're out, and if they're gone long, I need to know where they are. So they're not trapped. So why would somebody use like group A instead of group B is the conversation we have next, and a lot of them realize that, especially in Virginia, and that's, and I don't know how this would be in other states, but a lot of them say, okay, because a lot of people have ancestors who owned slaves. And then some will correct themselves and said, who enslaved people. So that's kind of interesting too, where they'll try to make the adjustment with their language. But that's always interesting when I introduce these questions, that they're realizing that the language we use to talk about slavery, the language that our textbooks use, textbooks carry a lot of authority. This is all language designed to sort of minimize something that's very, very serious. And I do two things at this point. One is I read to them the section of Eke Romani that says Davis was like nervous on the auction block when he was getting bought, but he didn't need to worry because his master was kind. And they say, is this why we don't use the textbook? And I say yes. Yeah.
I also use that textbook, and I remember learning direct objects because Dallas was getting beat.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That-
Yeah. And then we're taught to normalize it, because when a bell rings and you get up and go, and you know you're told to sit in the seat, if you're presented something, you take this as okay. The National Latin Exam, 2017, there's an Egyptian enslaved person named Alexander, and then there's the Egyptian slave, and one of the quotes on that exam is, "You are all the same, you're not in Egypt anymore, stop being lazy." In the story, and meanwhile you have Alexander and Egyptian slave. People print off this exam and use it for practice. It's still available online. 140,000 people take the National Latin Exam. I've got zero momentum in terms of boycott or anything, because it's just what teachers do. So it's things that we do and we normalize, and we've all done it and we've all normalized it. And at a certain point, you can do this lesson and you can find a more compassionate way, accurate way to teach about slavery. But if you're putting your kids in a room with the NLE, until they have a track record of doing it well, that's not an inclusive classroom at all. Yeah.
So whether you're using a textbook in the classroom or you're just using authentic texts, because like sort of ancient Roman material is typically framing sentences in sort of more list A than list B terms, how do you address that in translation, whether at the high school level or like when you're doing scholarship? Because obviously it's a lot easier sometimes to incorporate list B sort of enslaver and using that active vocabulary when you're not trying to directly translate a chunk of Latin for a paper or in an exam setting or something.
Well, one thing is, like, once I stopped using Eke Romani and I make a lot of my own material, I don't have as many sentences with enslaved people in them, as some kind of object. So, but I try to use that language consistently in the classroom. I wouldn't mark something wrong, but I would encourage them to use that kind of language. Certainly servant, a lot of students would like to use servant. But I tend not to even put a lot about slavery on the exam. It's traumatic, it's violent, and where you're gonna sit there and have to focus on your grade when you're thinking about something as awful as that. So, but I try to get them more aware of the language that they use. And then at that point, we sort of circle back, we sum up, we kind of define slavery. And then just in terms of our C's, in terms of connecting and comparing, all the students, most of them know, okay, but the enslaved people in ancient Rome were white. But I really tell that, so that's the point where I say, yes, and there's some differences, but this is the institution of slavery, and we're not gonna normalize it and sanitize it, because as an institution across time and across place, this is what slavery is. But I definitely mentioned that really particularly terrible feature of slavery here is racism. And one of the biggest points, and this is where the extra 45 minutes come in, is letting them know how we are still living out the effects of slavery today, and how important it is to get it right, even when we're talking about ancient slavery, because we're living out the effects here in terms of racism. And they all have questions about that. And in terms of, the way I explain it is, after slavery ended, you have replacements: lynching, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, second generation segregation in schools right now, things that perpetuate poverty structures. So I make sure it's extremely clear that this is not something that happened in ancient Rome. It's something that ended here after the Civil War. Like where we live and where we're learning is still, we are still living out those effects. So that's kind of not how I end it, but how I introduce the second part, so that they can see the ways that sort of plays out. And there's a self-taught scholar named Michael Twitty. He talks about culinary injustice. He's fantastic. He has a video, and he talks about, like, these are the hands that have touched the hands of someone who touched a slave. Like, he's on the plantation doing a reenactment, and people want to go there and see their people in crinoline, and there he is as an enslaved person, and he's that uncomfortable reality. But he mentions about rice and just the technology and just all the wealth that was established and stolen from enslaved people. But he brings up the Carolina Gold Rice Company, where the way that company established its wealth was because of technology, products, and it's $1 billion company, and the people who live around it are descendants of enslaved people and can't afford to buy a bag of that rice. So that's where I'm saying this is how we're still, living this out right now in terms of wealth and things like that. So I definitely want, especially living in Virginia, it's really important for me to let them know that when we're going to be talking about ancient Roman slavery, but it's really important that we understand that the institution of what the institution of slavery is, because framing this as a business transaction is very unjust. And in 1949, there was a scholar at Lincoln University, a white professor, that he named slavery as a barrier to access to classics then, and it was 70 years later, and we still have that same barrier. I'm
just wondering, do you ever have parents who get like very angry about this? And do you? Okay.
I've not ever had a parent call. And one thing I think people occasionally might misread about me is that I'm some, raging, flaming person, but really I'm not a cult leader. I have a background in mental health counseling, so I have a really, really strong sense that I need to respect my students' autonomy, and I'm extremely clear from day one. I'm giving them information and ideas. I'm not there to tell them how to think, and it's fine for them to disagree. But in terms of class, I'll say we're not going to defend slavery. We're not doing that here. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk to you. But I think because I'm not, I want them to be their own people. So I'm thinking that's might be what's insulating me from it, because I also think that classes tend to, you don't set up a conversation. When we've had issues, it's somebody will say something that is polarizing and invites pushback. Like, I don't think there's anything in here that invites pushback. I try to frame things I do where if you're going to push back, okay, like with the stuff from rape, why are you defending rape? Or why are you defending white supremacy? why are you defending this inaccurate distortion of slavery that is traumatizing for students? So it's not, so I think that that's why, because I'm not saying my classroom's apolitical, but it's not a partisan space. I think people feel comfortable in there, but I haven't gotten any pushback. And we have an equity coordinator now in my district, so I mean, we have we're Title I school. I think 40% of students are white. We have a large population of students who are English language learners, African-American students. So there's a big focus on equity in the district. So I feel supported, and I think the community generally supports that.
Speaking to what you were saying earlier, kind of the after-effects and the kind of secondary levels of the institution of slavery, to what extent does your curriculum, or even like, you know, this kind of lesson plan cover manumission or like Friedman or like that kind of?
Yeah, so yeah, I cover that too. I mean, we talk about, okay, so there's a lot of differences, and it's definitely not, in a way it's all slavery matters, but not in a way where it's like, oh, you know, white people were enslaved too. I definitely talk about manumission. Racism is a really big issue, and that's where I talk about that as a difference. Literacy, and I don't know if Vanessa's here, she and I talked about this, and she helped me, she shared some really interesting, you know, just thought around this that I hadn't considered much, but just in terms of, you know, literacy, cultural production, you know, there are differences, but I think starting, you know, if you're having an exam where why is a slave quiet and the correct answer is loyalty, I mean, really, you know, there's no reason for us to be teaching slavery like we're lost cause Confederates, especially in 2020, especially with what's going on with white supremacy. And just to close out, and I'll be around for questions. I mean, this is one lesson. Addressing these issues more ethically is you know, imperative for us, but the field as a whole, particularly at the secondary level, is it's in crisis. It's dangerous. Even in homogeneous classrooms, do we want white students learning about slavery the way I described on the National Latin exam? Like, is that? I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to say I'm concerned about white people getting radicalized in the secondary Latin classroom, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. And it's an emergency, because we tend to other white supremacy and pretend it's the hate group down the street or something on 8chan when it's in our classrooms right now. And it's in our classrooms because we haven't had leadership to set the tone and say, you know what, we're going on a hiatus for 3 years so we get this right. I hope that, you know, this was helpful in terms of what you do in the classroom, but I mean, I also hope that there's a sense of urgency that I needed to do this because of what's in our textbooks and what's on the National Latin exam. If you use the materials in secondary Latin as they're given to you, you know, I think it's a very dangerous situation. It's an oppressive situation. So I just hope that, you know, this is helpful, but, you know, those of you who are inclined and in a position to do so where it's not a danger or burden will consider getting involved with, you know, bringing about some larger change. So thank you.